and we've seen continue to see bad Fed policy after that, giving I think the illusion that this this weak recovery, and I think it has been a weak recovery, is again reflecting these sort of core problems with the U.S. economy. Now listen, we're sort of in a position where they've taken sort of different sides of the argument. We're sort of stuck with the economy is fine. We don't have to do anything. I'm not arguing that. I don't think Dan's arguing that. I think we should lower corporate tax rates. Maybe even get rid of the corporate tax rate. I think we should have more high-skill immigration. I'm not against more public investment, but I think the fundamental American model of capitalism just simply isn't broken. I think I need to see some repairing around the edges. I think, as Bill Clinton said, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right in America. And I think that's absolutely true. That those core values of rewarding entrepreneurs, of allowing markets to work, when we do allow that, I think we'll produce good economic growth in the future, just like we had in the past. Listen, can we grow 3% in the future? I think we absolutely can. Do we need higher productivity? We do. But I would be worried. If we were in a position of sort of optimal policy outcome, that we had done everything. We already had the high skill immigration. We had lowered corporate taxes. We had fixed our schools, and we could only grow 2%. I guess then I would be worried. I'm not nearly as pessimistic about policy as what Ed is, and we can get into that there are these huge gulfs separating. Actually, I think the two sides are far closer than what we think. It's very hard to see that during a presidential election season. And when I worked at Reuters breaking views, I worked with a lot of Brits, and they were very pessimistic, maybe projecting the decline of Great Britain onto the United States. And the Tea Party, they're all crazy. U.S. politics is broken. I really don't see. I see a lot of resurgence. I see a lot of reinvigoration in the American political process. So I think we need. I'm not arguing for the status quo. I think we need change, but the quote John McCain back in 2000, I think the fundamentals of the economy are sound as properly defined, and I think they'll serve well America into the future.
Well, thank you, Jim, very much. Well, Dan, now it's your opportunity. Okay. You expressed some skepticism about the Atkinson view, and now's the chance for you to probe it.
It's one of the things I have difficulty grappling with is this, there's a group of people I call the yes-buts. And these are the people, I'll make my whole case and they'll say, yes, but what about this? And yes, but what about that? And when we talk about, say, exports, which, again, up on a monthly basis about 50% from March of '09, they're up 5% so far this year, despite the slowdown we're having. The answer is always, yes, but we import more, which is true. But, I guess the question I ask for Rob is, are you dismissing the rise in export, the value, the sum, the trend in export? I mean, $2.2 trillion is a lot of stuff, and it's agricultural commodities, which we're incredibly productive at. 10 guys can farm 10,000 acres of wheat. It's large machinery, services, et cetera. To me, the exports as a sign of engagement, as a sign of a country that, we only have borders with two countries, and we're isolated from everywhere else by oceans. We're very parochial people. Very few of us have passports, and yet we're exporting, like crazy compared to a few years ago. So, what is it about the sum, the nature, the breakdown of exports that doesn't give you heart?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, just a little bit of a quip. Our largest export by weight is scrap paper. Not really sure that's a big important thing to our economy. But look, yeah, exports have gone up, but imports have gone up faster. So each year since 2009, 2008, the trade deficit has increased. And at the end of the day, that is what matters. So let's just say exports go up by $100 billion, but imports go up by $300 billion, and those imports are at the cost of U.S. production. That would mean that we're losing $200 billion worth of U.S. output, U.S. jobs, and the high value added part related to it. The other point I want to make clear is it's not just the it's not just the amount of the exports, it's the and imports, it's the composition. We now run a manufacturing economy that is less high-tech than the Japanese, than the Koreans, than the Germans. We have a much bigger share of our manufacturing in essentially low-technology commodity production than the Germans, Japanese, or Koreans do. So what we've been, we do export, I agree, but what we're importing are much more about high-value added production, and I think that's a problem. The fact that we continue to run massive trade deficits at an unprecedented level, both as a percent and as an absolute number, and that there's very, very clear evidence. I mean, David Otter's work at MIT attributed 2.2 million of the lost manufacturing jobs to China. Those aren't just all T-shirt jobs. I mean, those are real high-value, many of those are high-value added manufacturing. So that's why I would worry about it.
So actually, the scrap paper actually speaks to something quite important about our economy. And the reason we export all the scrap paper is because China doesn't really have any wood. And they have huge needs for making paper and cardboard, et cetera. So they have to go around the world because they can't grow wood. We have lumber and timber, but they want our scrap paper because they need that stuff to go make paper. And we have developed systems over the years, although we're seen as these incredibly wasteful, obese, environmentally unfriendly people, we've developed systems to recover and recycle paper. So the percentage of paper that is recycled now compared with a few years ago and 10 years ago, I think it's up to 70%. So we're creating a lot of paper without having to make any wood. And you know, in Newsweek, we're doing our part because, starting next year, we're not going to be out in paper. So that's a different form of recycling. But to me, that's actually kind of a great example of how, in an age of climate, we've changed a system of consumption and production and developed these very sophisticated logistics systems that now go deeper into the waste system to pull out all the scrap paper just so that we can send it to China. That may not be someone's vision of high value added, but there's a huge need for this in the world. And that gets to another point, which is that I think fundamentally what we're seeing is the rest of the world is starting to consume more like us. And the rest of the world is growing richer. And the question I have is to you, in a world in which maybe not everybody is as rich as the US or as wealthy as the US, but incomes and consuming habits are much closer to ours, is that in and of itself a negative or a positive for the US?
Yeah, so let me just say first one, because I think one of the reasons it's easy for declinists to have their view and why it's easy for optimists to have their view is the U.S. economy is two economies. It's a dual economy. And we have a really great sort of domestic serving economy. I like the part of your book especially about that, Dan. So there's an amazing amount of innovation that goes on. You're talking about recycling and efficiencies and our hotel sector. Go to a European hotel, you'll understand why America's a great country. Our logistics system, our retail sector. I don't dispute that. And that's, by the way, why our GDP tends to outperform Europe. But I don't think we should be in this kind of debate where we can't also at the same time acknowledge that our traded sector, which is over a third of our economy, that's the vulnerable part of our economy. That's where other countries, I think, have an advantage on us. So I think when we have to look at that, first of all. That's, by the way, I also want to make one other point. We heard about Japan earlier. One of the problems with these debates is they tend to look at per GDP, overall or per capita. If you actually look at per worker income in Japan, per worker income in Japan has grown faster over the last decade than, according to New World Bank numbers, than U.S. per worker income.
They're running out of workers.
But that's a social policy issue, and the goal of economic policy is not to have high fertility rates. The goal of economic policy is really only two things. It's high productivity, so existing workers have a lot of money, and high innovation. The Japanese are good at both of those. So.
Right, but if you don't have any immigration and you don't have any fertility, you're not going to have a country in 50 years.
Sure they will. First of all, the Japanese have too many people. It's a crowded country. They don't have enough room. If the Japanese decide as a conscious policy that they want to downsize their population by 20%, it has no effect on their overall economy from a perspective of a Japanese person. It only has an effect is if you somehow think you want to rank economies by size. If we want to rank economies by size, we should take over Canada, and then we'd become a bigger economy.
That's an excellent idea.
Well, as a Canadian, I think it is a good idea, yeah.
But again, when you're talking about our tradable economy, and obviously a lot of focus on the downside risks, it seems to me there are a lot of upsides. For example, natural gas, much debated. We can start, well, we are not exporting that at all. The price of natural gas in the U.S. compared to what it is in, say, Japan, I think it's probably higher by a factor of 6 to 1, and we're finally starting to see investments to export it. Services, again, tourism, education, healthcare, money management, accounting, publishing, media, these are all things that which we do a lot of that are expensive, and that the rest of the world, as it stands up, shows a great propensity to acquire. And so why are we focusing on tradable manufacturing to the, I don't want to say exclusion, but maybe downplaying some of these services and commodities that have a huge amount of upside?
Yeah, just to be clear, we released a report a couple weeks ago on a national traded sector strategy, which we intentionally did not call a manufacturing strategy because there are, as you rightly point out, many services that are tradable, and we tend to do better in those. So I completely agree with you. Tradable services are important, including higher education, as you mentioned, which is tradable. The point is that services are such a small share of our overall trade balance that even though we run a modest surplus in trade, in services, it's nowhere near enough to account for the massive goods deficit. So under the most optimistic scenarios, which we've done and Brookings has done, of saying services exports are going to keep growing, there's no way that you can get a trade balance. One last point on that. One of the things, I don't actually think services are going to grow that much because other countries are dramatically expanding their own services policies. They're putting up very, very restrictive protectionist policies with regard to services. Natural gas, if we start exporting more natural gas, by definition the price is going to go up, which means we lose one advantage we have from the great natural gas revolution, which is low factor input cost. Last point on richer countries. Yeah, richer countries are good. We want countries to get rich. Whether they're rich or they're poor has no inherent effect on our trade balance or whether we're losing our manufacturing or not.
Well, thank you both. A spirited discussion with insight garnered on both sides. Now, Jim, you're not going to get away with just another couple tweets here. I'm turning things over to Ed for some tough questions.
It's very hard for me not to think in 140 characters. Really now.
Feel free to answer in 140 characters. You set out a case of...
Am I asking him questions? Is he asking me?
Well, he's asking you.
Oh, he's
questions.
asking. I wasn't prepared.
You can answer with a question. Answer with a question if you like.
I think 140 characters, limericks, anything.
So. All right.
I'll retweet you. You set out a pretty, as expected, Panglossian case that this was a blip, 07, 08, and that the decade before was actually fine. In fact, the exceptional decade, the one that the outlier was the 1990s. The decade, the reversion to the mean was the first decade of this century, which is also what I think. But what you didn't address is any of the longer-term structural points that Rob and I and many others have made that are the ultimate determinant of the competitiveness of the economy. Its skills, relative skills, its educational output, its ability to earn rising living standards for most of its people. Could you explain why these various trends have been happening, why they're so deeply rooted, and what it is about them that you think is going to make them disappear in the near future?
Well, I think at its core, your story sort of doesn't hold together. It's sort of the what's the matter with Kansas issue that you basically to believe your story, you have to believe that since the early 1970s, that incomes have been flat. So now 40 years, incomes have been flat, but people sort of didn't notice. They didn't notice their incomes were flat for 40 years, so they kept voting for, you can call them neoliberal, you can call them pro-market, presidents, whether it's Reagan, whether it's Bill Clinton, whether it's George Bush, even Barack Obama, who I think ran very much as a continuation of Bill Clinton. That somehow they just didn't notice it, that they weren't doing well, and they didn't end up voting for someone who's promising to redistribute wealth, or there wasn't a third party that popped up. And I
haven't made those arguments.
No, but I know. But I'm saying
you're responding to
you did a median
man.
weight, and I think the answer is that's just not true. That's really a poor history of the past 40 years. That you're saying we've had basically a problem growing bigger. Now we're sort of reaping the fruits of that. And I don't think medium incomes have been flat for 40 years. I don't think it. Robert Gordon, the economist, doesn't think it. I think you can find that we have mismeasured income because we've mismeasured inflation decade after decade, and that explains why we haven't had this third party rise up. So I think just the foundation of the U.S. economy is much stronger today. It hasn't sort of been on decline because fundamentally what you're arguing is that it's been on decline for decades. An economy that can't boost income or wages, well, that's not a particularly good economy. And I'm saying that economy has done that for 40 years. Now, as far as the longer-term structural issues, I do. This is part where sort of I think the debate breaks down a little bit because I do think like we need to, again, lower corporate taxes, more high-skilled immigration. I don't think there are any guarantees just because what's worked in the past that we're sort of destined to be a fast-growing economy in the future. But I think those sort of policy issues I think are doable, and I think Washington can do them, which kind of goes to your point where you don't think they can.
I'm a lot more pessimistic than you, yes. But we'll get to that in a minute. It'll have to be 1 minute as well. Just to clarify, so you think the BLS, the Census Bureau, etc., they're wrong on their measurement of median incomes?
Yes, I do.
You do.
And
do you also,
I'm hardly the only one who believes this.
No, I know. Well, it's yeah. That'll take 5 minutes.
I can
to
find
debate.
people on both sides of the aisle.
That'll take 5 minutes to debate. You also think the numbers are wrong on educational outcomes?
I'm not arguing the educational outcomes, but I find it also interesting that, again, this has been a reoccurring, repetitive story about failing U.S. schools, and they very well may not be doing a very good job at the middle school, high school level. But again, there's an amazing transformation that happens where all of a sudden kids go to college and they end up graduating and becoming these highly productive workers and entrepreneurs who create these great companies, despite the fact we have these perpetually fail. It's almost like you say about Brazil. They said about Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be. Well, America's in decline, and it will apparently always be declining, despite the fact we're able to produce high levels of economic growth, productivity, and these amazing technology companies.
I don't dispute the productivity. I do, though, dispute this story you tell about college graduates. College graduates have also seen, it's not just high school leavers or dropouts, have also seen a decline in their average earnings since 2000, a very sharp one. Not since 2008, since 2000. How do you explain that? Again, do you just say it's not true, the figures are wrong?
Well, no, and I'm not really writing off the entire 1990s. I'm saying that part of the 90s saw an abnormally high level of growth. And I think the simple explanation, and I think this also that happens to be the right explanation, is what we saw was a reversion to the mean in the 2000s. Now, that's not writing off the Great Recession, but I think to look at that we've had this lost decade, I just don't think the facts support that.
So onto the politics quickly.
Right.
You mentioned that it's easy to get sort of pessimistic about polarization because it's a presidential election. But I think, we've been saying this for a lot longer than the duration of this election, and I wrote my book way before this election. What is it that makes you think they're going to come together and have a kumbaya moment after November the 6th? What is it that's going to change how this town has been behaving in the last few years?
Well, I think longer term, either you make changes or markets will force you to make changes. And I think in the nearer term, at least I think on the Republican side, I don't think it's just propaganda. That they do believe that changes need to be made, or we're facing a near-term financial crisis. And when you do have one side that I think at its heart believes we only have 1 or 2 years before the whole thing blows up, I think that's an amazing catalyst for action. And it is not hard to come up, I think, with a grand bargain. I think, and this is, I think, one of the great misunderstood things, is you take the vice presidential nominee for Republicans, Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan's, viewed as, on the far right, an extremist. But I think Paul Ryan and Paul Ryan Republicans, if they were offered a deal where they got some sort of premium support Medicare plan, would they accept some sort of tax increases in exchange for that? Well, I think they absolutely would. And listen, you can argue that the premium support plan in some ways isn't a lot different than Obamacare, because both are relying on the private sector, choice, competition. Obviously, there's some major differences, but conceptually, they're close enough that you can do a deal. I just don't think they're that far apart.
Finally, I can't resist, because you mentioned my nationality, projecting my country's history. How would you explain those who share my diagnosis who have your accent, which is many, many people?
I'm not a psychologist. I don't get it.
You're a psychologist of me.
Listen, what I always say when I have a bad day, I say, well, how bad can it be? You know, I live in the United States of America. You know, that pumps me up. I'm ready for the next. So I just don't understand the pessimism just at a internal level.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to take at least a few of those minutes that were allotted to let me ask some questions and help make up my own mind about, are we declining, are we rising, is the news good, is the picture more than half full as it appears to be here? Rob, let me start with you. One of the things that you really call for in your book is the need for a national innovation strategy. Why don't we have that kind of strategy already?
Because we're the greatest country in the world and we don't need one. And the second reason is because if we do, we'll be violating our faith in free markets. And Jim, just to let you know, even though I think that if we don't act, we're in decline, I'm not calling for a socialist takeover. I actually think
I liked every one of your policy ideas I heard. I think the public investment, the core, I thought they were all great.
Thank you. I do think one of the differentiating factors between us and other countries, or many other countries, is they actually have active innovation. First of all, they think they're in competition. We don't think we're in competition. They think that if they don't compete and really, really work hard, they're going to fall behind. They don't just rely on the fact that there's been this kind of steamboat inertia. And thirdly, they're not dominated by what are called neoclassical economists who think markets get it right and innovation is manna from heaven, which is how our economists think. So what an innovation policy says is, yes, the private sector is going to lead in innovation, but there are myriad market failures around innovation. Chicken and egg problems, system coordination problems, externality problems. I mean, there's a new study we just cited on our blog that showed that the externalities from R&D anywhere between 3 and 4 times that companies don't get all the benefits. So if you don't have an active innovation policy, you're not going to maximize the ability to be innovative. I'll just say one quick point, by the way, Jim, you mentioned, I think, there was declinist talk in the 80s and 90s, and that actually exactly proves my point. We had declinist talk in the 80s and 90s, which people took seriously. They didn't say, oh, we had declinist talk in the 50s. And what did they do? They passed an array of laws and policies. We got the R&D tax credit. We changed the prudent man rule to open up the venture capital industry. We created NIST. We expanded NSF funding. We did a whole array of things because we felt if we didn't act, we were going to lose. So I think just sort of putting our head under the bushel basket and saying, oh, we're not going to decline. My argument is we're exactly where we were in the 80s and 90s. But what we did back then is we had bipartisan agreement to put in place a lot of those policies, which I think you and I both agree on.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I like those policies.
Well, Dan, let me turn next to you. As I mentioned, I thoroughly enjoyed your book, and I think I learned from your book. And sometimes I'm probably one of your yes buts, I suppose. And I wanted to probe the thinking here about what you two portrayed as a permanent private sector revolution as being a key driver of the kind of changes that made you feel optimistic. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, we associate kind of continuous improvement with Japanese, and of course, total quality management was a American invention that our industries weren't interested in the 40s, so he had to go to Japan to sell them. And I look at kind of the concept of efficiency, rationalization. To a large degree, I think these are American inventions. It's Frederick Winslow Taylor walking around with his stopwatch. You look at what Henry Ford did with the Model T, and this is kind of when before I got into journalism, I studied history in graduate school, and I've wrote a few books about business history. But the accomplishment of what he took, started building cars sort of one by one, and then started building an assembly line, and then it ends up with the River Rouge plant to the point where a Model T cost $260 in 1920. One of the great historical feats ever. And this is something that American companies are quite good at. Then in total quality management, you can sort of put management consulting to a degree in that box. And again, when I started to look around at companies that were growing in '08 and '09 as a business reporter, the ones that were doing well were ones who were kind of selling efficiency as a business. And whether it was, I use this example, and it's a small company, but it's a great metaphor. It's a company outside Boston. It's called Big Belly Solar. They make solar-powered trash compactors. It's manufactured in the U.S., and it gathers the energy, and most of what you throw away is air, so the garbage piles up, it hits a beam, it compacts it down, so instead of having, and then it sends you a text message when it's ready to be empty. So instead of having to rumble your truck around every day, you send it out once every 7, once every 8 days. And then they sold this as a system to a city like Philadelphia, which is having to do huge budget cuts, problems with productivity, et cetera. It pays back its investment in a year and then throws off cash, essentially. It's a cash machine. Now, this is a small company, $20 million in sales. But what it shows you, and I think you can go and find company after company, system after system, that can be tuned up, improved, even if the government isn't helping and they're cutting the spending on it, just by, if you could have a business model that shares in the savings in some way, that's tremendous. And when we talk about our broken systems, transport, waste collection, aviation, you could imagine applying some of these things at scale to other areas. And so these sorts of things give me, these are the sort of things that give me some optimism, the sense that if you take, again, municipal garbage collection is the worst, it's either run by the mob and you have these union guys who are getting paid $100 an hour and it smells and the trucks come down the street while people are sitting at their cafes and there's nothing you can do about it. This shows that with not all that much capital, you can do something about it, and pretty quickly. And if things like that are adapted, if we start thinking about how to do these systematically, there's not a system that cannot be improved. You see it in, the Easy Pass. Back in the day, people used to have to pay a toll when they got to a bridge. And now you go and it does it automatically. And the next thing is, it'll do it while you're going 50 miles an hour.
So this is your kind of aim high, but be
well, it's
sort of steady progress.
It's a matter of not settling for what you have and not thinking that the screwed up system we have can't be improved absent an investment of trillions of dollars.
One of the things you said, I think, would certainly resonate with Ed when you urged everyone to be sure and read the FT and not just the Wall Street Journal to get a sense of how the rest of the world,
especially the editorial page,
who looks at the United States as really a force for leadership and so forth. And I remember a column by Philip Stevens who was saying, well, those that want to see decline in America just might want to really look at the world if they get what they want. But Ed, I want to turn to you and some of your conversations with Jeff Garten, where you talked a good deal about how CEOs think, the incentives they have. And you saw them, as I remember, being driven by often the big pension funds and other mutual funds for whom the incentives are quite short-term, and that translated in short-term incentives for the CEOs. What do we do about that? We worried about that short-termism in the 1980s. What do we do about it?
It's not, one of the reasons that I'm relatively pessimistic is there are a number of issues such as short-termism in terms of the way businesses make their decisions, and on education, for example, where there aren't easy answers. There are easy answers for immigration reform. You can imagine it being done in a few weeks in Congress and the whole problem of the last 12 years being reversed. So in terms of corporate incentives, you've had various sort of half-baked initiatives like Say on Pay that have tilted things in the right direction. But I think that the sort of exponential rate of globalization and the integration of the global economy and the increasing competitiveness of every sector is going to make it very, very difficult to move back to the era of patient capital. If you look at the trends in the venture capital industry, Rob mentioned there's been a very sharp decline in venture capital fundraising. And what you've seen in Sand Hill Road and other parts of the VC community in America is a takeover by Wall Street, by investment bankers, a financialization of the American economy. in the last 10 to 12 years. That is very, very hard to reverse. You'd have to, pull up the drawbridge, or become in terms of trade, become protectionist, become technophobic in terms of the impact of technology. Both of which are cures worse than the diseases. I think what America can do is more in the public policy sphere, in terms of how it incentivizes investment, what kind of investment America would like to see. People often talk about the fact that America doesn't do industrial policy. But it does industrial policy for Wall Street. If you look at the panoply of incentives you have for the financial sector, this is clearly, a product of very effective lobbying by very deep pockets, by oligarchic capitalism, I would say. And you have industrial policy for big oil, for fossil fuel energy. You have an industrial policy for the defense industrial sector, although a decreasingly effective one. So I would argue it's in these areas, more than in attempting, like King Canute, to roll back the tides of short-termism, that America can actually change the game.
Can I just interject one thing? You contrast the amount of venture capital in the 90s and then Wall Street coming in and taking over. The reason there's no venture capital in Silicon Valley, or there's not as much of it, is because they set all the money that everybody gave them in the 90s on fire. They put $1 billion into Webvan. Of course, there are going to be no $1 billion Webvans anymore. And Jim was talking about, it's kind of the 90s as an outlier in some areas, and we're sort of seeing some mean regression. One of the things that gets people thinking about decline is these sort of comparisons to bubble era peaks. So a lot of the housing activity we had, a lot of the consumption activity we had in 05-06 was false. It all had to be given back because people defaulted on it.
Let me just, I actually have exhausted my time, and since I'm an economist, I'll make a seasonal adjustment so I can ask Jim a quick question. That you made a point that maybe we really haven't declined. My question is, have we really kept pace with the world? Let me give you a couple questions. One is on the education front. We're about to publish a paper by Paul Vallis, who's a well-known education reformer, and he makes the point that it's not so much that our schools are not doing the same job they did 25 years ago. It's that the world's moved on. The same is true with regard to college graduation rates. If you talk to Andreas Schleicher, who does the analysis of the PISA exams, he will point out that the US has actually slightly higher rate of people finishing a 4-year degree, but it has now slipped to 9th or perhaps lower in terms of the rest of the world. So how do we keep pace with a world that's becoming ever more competitive while we seem to be kind of making just those incremental movements forward?
Sort of again, I don't want to be put in the position of arguing for the status quo. That I don't believe there are issues and problems that we need to deal with. So some degree, on that front, I may not be quite as optimistic as being on this side of the table. Certainly, I think education reform is one where I think there need to be big and sweeping changes. But particularly on the college degree, I certainly don't think that the cure is that we need to have more 4-year college graduates with liberal arts education. I think what we need is people who, after high school, go and get an education that's useful, has value, and will allow them to compete in the global economy. Now, that may mean going to a 4-year college. That may mean some sort of apprenticeship system, which there's a huge social stigma to not getting a 4-year degree now, but to a great degree, it's only a signaling a device is saying, hey, you got your act together, you went to a 4-year college. So I think that there's actually too much emphasis on people going to certainly get a 4-year college degree, while there's not enough emphasis on a sort of really quality continuing education.
Thank you all. Well, let me, it's now your turn. Let me, there's a gentleman here. If you could please wait for the microphone. And there's one back there. Sam, if you could get over to this distinguished gentleman. And then please identify yourself. Well, there you go. There's one right there.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with American University and Transnational Strategy Group. And Ken, thank you again for organizing this event. I had a couple of observations and then a general question for the panel very quickly. I really want to believe what these two gentlemen are saying. I really do. And it was very interesting to listen to them. I think Dan was, one comment sort of that I tried to put here is, if our country were declining, how could our businesses do so well? I think you said something like that. One observation there is that in a world in which many of our companies are becoming increasingly transnational, untethered from the U.S. economy, where goals indeed may be quite different between what a company's goals are and the national goals, it may not be that difficult to answer your question. And I think, Jim, you had mentioned something about allow the markets to work. But in a world which is increasingly where authoritarian state capitalist countries are a larger and larger portion of the world's economy, I mean, I'd love markets. What I don't like is what countries like that are doing to them. And to the extent that we are dealing in that kind of world, obviously in our traded sector, it's something that's important to think about. Now, the question is Germany. I mean, here you have a non-authoritarian, Western-oriented, democratic country with trade surpluses in manufacturing, indeed even with China. What's the lesson for us?
Well, I don't want to say Germany's a one-trick pony, because they do a lot of, they manufacture a lot of different stuff. But if you really focus on one thing and have that as a centerpiece of your economy, you will have some, it's easy to get results. I think we have, in some ways, a more diversified economy than Germany. And Germany also has this, strange situation in the the Eurozone, which, once they sort of loathe, a large amount of their exports go to their other people in the Eurozone that have been financed ultimately by debts that they are not able to pay. And it's a different form of the problem we had here, where people were.
You're saying it's a bubble.
What? I'm not
It's
saying
a
it's a
German
bubble.
bubble.
I'm just saying it's if you want to call it vendor financing, or I don't know that the triumph of their exports. I mean, all the capital goods they exported to Greece aren't really exports, because Greece isn't paying. In the end, Greece isn't going to pay for them, and neither are their customers in Spain. And so, if your model is to export expensive stuff to Greece and Italy and Spain, I don't know if that's so much more enviable. That's such an enviable model.
The gentleman.
Hi, I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I'd like to talk about the future of the planet, sustainability particularly. And the 3 R's of sustainability are reduce, reuse, and recycle. If you don't need something, don't buy it. If something's still usable, keep using it or get it to someone who can use it. And if it's finally not usable, then recycle it so you don't have to go and get the basic raw materials. Well, every time you do any one of those, you're hurting the GDP. Every time you walk or take a bicycle or public transportation instead of driving someplace, you're hurting the GDP. Every time you prepare your own food from scratch, or heaven forbid, grow your own food, you're hurting the GDP. Every time you do anything that's good for the future of the planet, you're hurting the GDP. So if we really care about the future of the planet, we should be doing everything we can to reduce the GDP. From another point of view, standard of living is a family of 2 with a $4,000 square foot home and 3 cars. Really? Does they have a higher standard of living than a family of 2 with a $2,000 home and 2 cars and 2 bicycles? Or even a family of 2 with a 1,000 square foot home and 1 car and 2 bicycles, and no need for a car because things are accessible or there's good public transportation and all that? Is our measure of standard of living really meaningful? Is it time for us to totally change the way we measure our economy? And if so, does this whole argument change?
Well, who would like to tackle that? Rob?
Rob would.
Of course, somebody with a bigger house has a higher standard of living.
Really?
That's by definition, of course. And secondly, your assertion that when you don't consume something, GDP goes down is simply wrong. If you don't consume something, you do it in some other form. So it's not a question of that. Besides, the whole point is what we're concerned about in the economy is productivity. That's what we're concerned about. We're not concerned about GDP. We're concerned about 2 things, productivity and innovation. Last point, I just have to say, Look, you can recycle all you want. It's not going to make any difference. The only fundamental answer to all of this is about really fundamental innovation that's going to allow us to produce energy and other goods in a brand new, sustainable way. So whether we all drive Priuses or not is sort of, or wear Birkenstocks is irrelevant.
But when you say that, you know, standard of living is better by definition, I'm saying the definition's wrong.
Jim?
I like my big screen TV.
In every room?
I actually would love
Preferably.
it. I really would. I was thinking about that last night when I watched the debate on my TiVo or DVR.
I just wanted to follow up and talk about the, you know, to me the miracle, the absolute miracle of the past 200 years was that in 1800, if you lived in the West in Europe, adjusted for inflation, you were living on $2 a day, $3 a day. Today, you were living, adjusted for inflation, $130, $140, $150 a day. Well, why did that happen? What changed? Did that come from? Was it from trade? Well, that helped. Was it from? Did we start savings more? Well, people save money. That sort of helped. Did people discover capitalism? Well, people were always trading. What happened over 200 years was that people began to embrace and respect business and innovation. That was the big difference over that. And if we get nothing else right, if we value the innovator's deal, which is the innovator says, let me innovate, reward me, and I will make myself rich, and I will make society rich. If we get that one thing, continue to get that right, I feel very positive about the future.
Gentleman there, and then the gentleman in the back there.
Yes, Van McMurtry. I heard on the news, I believe yesterday, is this not on? Okay. I heard on the news yesterday that the Chinese government, their official news agency, said something to the effect that it's really unfortunate that American public officials are bashing China and blaming America's decline on China. So apparently the Chinese government believes that we're in decline, and they're even willing to go out and say it in public. Is a fact like that important in this debate? The perception that America's in decline by the perception by the Chinese, for example, that we're in decline, is that important to the solution here?
Maybe I should answer that question that we have at the Wilson Center relationship with the Counselor's Office of the State Council. I think of it as a standing blue ribbon commission that is largely made up by retired senior civil servants, vice chairmen of different agencies. They get requests directly from the cabinet in China and from the top of the party. We recently had a 4-day look at innovation. The first day was how do we think of our innovation system, how do they approach innovation in China. We took them to visit NIST, we took them to visit the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, we took them to Boston. And after one of the senior people walked through the MIT Media Lab, they said, seriously, well, maybe it's not all over for America yet. So I think the perception question is important, and that's part of what the Kissinger Institute tries to do, is to make sure that these perceptions are not badly skewed by a headline or perhaps over-optimism in one country or another, or over-pessimism here.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, look, the Chinese, the main thing they export that they're better at than anybody else is propaganda. So, which is exactly what that statement is. The Chinese are basically saying, the fact that we have been intentionally screwing you for 10 years after we joined the WTO through forced technology transfer, currency manipulation, standards manipulation, unfair government procurement, massive subsidies to our SOEs, and a number of IP theft. The fact that we've been doing that for 10 years has no effect on the fact that you've lost 2.5 million manufacturing jobs directly as a result of our policies. Just ignore that. So what they're trying to do is to deflect what I think is absolutely the right attention about unfair practices in China. The point about China is not to say that we don't want China to get rich or that China's unfair policies are to account for all of our problems. But they certainly account for some of our problems. And we can't deny that. And if China were playing by the WTO rules, we would have a better economy today.
I also think that a lot of this is, I'm not in the, just as I'm not in the American decliner school, I'm not in the sort of China triumphalist school. Obviously China is very intensely nationalistic. One of the things it's permitted to say is that other places stink and we're great. But we had Dickensian workplaces where teenagers worked and lived in barracks and things like that, and we had cities with air where you couldn't breathe. And that was 100 years ago. China has such a long way to go to even think about approaching the border of where the U.S. is as far as standards of living. We all look at Shanghai and Beijing, and Tom Friedman goes and sees their bullet trains, which have a tendency to fall off the tracks every now and then. But last time I was in China, I went to a village with about 40 people living on $15 a month that had just gotten electricity maybe 10 years ago and just got TV 2 years ago. There's no economic activity going on there. And there are 400 million people living like that. And so I think a lot of this talk that you get from China is, they have their own terrible demographic problems. They have millions of college graduates who they don't have appropriate employment for, social tensions. They imprison writers. I can think of some writers I'd like to imprison, but some of them work for me. But I think a lot of this sort of is deflection / projection, and I don't take it all that seriously.
The gentleman in the back there.
Jim Sang. Our declinists tell me, I think I've heard, that we need to make lots of changes. Jim, in talking about education, indicated that we need to make lots of changes, and I have the feelings that our non-declinists also say that we need to make lots of changes. Is that true? And are the non-declinists basically saying that they think it's more likely we'll make the changes that we have to, whereas the declinists are more worried, or am I missing the boat?
Been discovered. Yeah, well, listen, I don't know, Dan, but yeah, I think we need to make changes. I guess I partially it's I may feel a bit better about sort of the American model of capitalism than some other folks. I think we do need changes, but I guess part of it is I am fundamentally a lot more optimistic about the ability of our political system to respond in the past, and again I just don't think the policy differences really are that far apart that we can't make the changes in the future. So I think that's part of it.
If we don't make the changes,
we're going to hell. It's done. It's over. It's over.
Look, every system we have can and should be improved, and starting with the lines at JFK when you fly in, and come into this country, or the terminal at JFK. I mean, the whole it's a joke, and the fact that 63 million people come here with the way we process and treat tourists. It's kind of like a lot of all this good stuff happens in spite of these terrible systems we have. So just imagine if they work a little better. Yeah, and the thing about education, I think the thing that's challenging about it as a debating subject or an argument, we're always told how awful our public schools are. I went to a public school. My parents went to public schools in New York City. I had a fantastic education. My kids go to public school.
Where's New York City public school? I went to science.
Well, he went to Bronx Science,
yeah, so
but he went to the regular. I understand, but saying so many of the people in the policy elites, so we put it, have fantastic experiences with public schools, and their kids have fantastic experiences with public schools, and we all pretty much had fantastic experience with higher education, and we're all sitting here because our higher education gave us something that we could use in a trade and something we could do with it. And so I think there's a tendency to see the numbers that Ed points to as sort of an what do you mean we're not producing educational outcomes?
Relative to other countries is my point. As somebody had a really bad experience at a private school and not in this country, can I just go back to the broader point both of you were making, but Jim made about the world since 1800. In 1800, the world economy, in 1750, the world economy looked roughly as it should have done by population, and then Europe and then latterly the US took off. There was the Industrial Revolution. 15% of the world became fantastically rich by historical standards, leaving the other, sometimes at the expense of and because of the other 85%, sometimes leaving them behind. And I think it's worth, in all this debate, in terms of how to frame what's going on here, to draw on Michael Spence, the Canadian economist, and his tale of the great convergence, because what we're living through is a period where those 85% are quite rightly and happily for everybody catching up with us. And it's going to take, we're maybe 30, 40 years into this process. It maybe is going to take another century. But whilst that happens, their incomes are going to be rising, Dan. They're in Dickensian conditions, a lot of them. A lot of them are in extraordinarily middle-class conditions in China too. Their incomes are going to be rising, and the pressure on our incomes is going to be downwards. This is a convergence. And so the way to deal with it is to have massive rethinking and new investment in education, worker training, lifetime upskilling, all of the things that are not just going to happen because you're American. They're only going to happen if you actually do them rather than talking about them.
Let me just add one thing to that, because I think, just on the education thing, I really think we get it, just so wrong. We have this notion that our higher education system is wonderful and our K through 12 is problematic. We actually, according to a recent study we did, we rank 22nd now in the world in higher education R&D support as a share of our economy. 22nd, or 21 other countries that invest more in their university R&D. There's a recent study, a guy at Virginia Tech and a guy at NYU found that half of college sophomores at the end of their sophomore year have learned nothing between the time they entered college, the time they finished their sophomore year. Another study by the Educational Testing Service showed that only 39% of college seniors are fully literate. So we have a serious problem, and I think what distinguishes declinists from optimists is not that the optimists don't think we need changes. Jim and Dan have both argued for changes. It's that I think Ed and I would argue our problems are so severe that we need real big changes, serious, dramatic changes. So for example, everybody's arguing, we should lower the corporate tax a little bit here and there and make it revenue neutral. I think we should lower it to 20%, not make it revenue neutral, and expand big investment incentives in R&D and capital equipment. Schools, if we just tinker around the edges. I think infrastructure, science funding, that to me is what differentiates. And the second thing I think that differentiates declinists from optimists is both Ed and I I know you are and I am too, I'm much more pessimistic about our ability and willingness as a country to make those changes. I think we've turned as a country very selfish, very inward, very much about our getting our gratification right now. I mean, you ask Americans, are you willing to pay 5 cents more for gas tax? Which, by the way, you pay less for gas tax than you did a decade ago in inflation-adjusted dollars. Can you pay 5 cents more? Can we even index the gas tax to inflation? And the answer is no. I'm not going to do that. Are you kidding me? Well, how are we going to have a world-class infrastructure system if Americans are unwilling to do just the simplest of things? So it's not just that we have a polarized system. I think we have a populace that is essentially being unwilling to work for the collective good, unwilling to work for the next generation. And when you have a political economy that can't let you take, I was at a dinner the other night, somebody said the definition of a declining country is a country whose political economy cannot take needed action. And I think that's much more about where Ed and I are than maybe Dan and Jim.
And yet, the reason we're running out of gas tax revenues is because our cars are getting substantially more fuel efficient. Right? The typical car sold in 2011 was probably 10 to 15% more fuel efficient than the typical car sold in 2007. We're now having, every day, they're putting vehicles on the road that run on electricity and natural gas. We had a big federal law that has a mandate to double, I'm sounding like Barack Obama here, that says this country, if you want to produce cars in this country and sell them, it has to get double the mileage it gets today. That is a pretty darn big industrial policy with a law, with a mandate, backed by money that was passed in this climate. So that's not, we got, as Bill Murray said in Caddyshack, we've got that going for us, which is nice.
Well, let's take one last question, and then we'll have to wrap up. I promised everyone you'd be out by 4:30.
Dan Lieberman, you mentioned the trade deficit, but the money comes back in the country by essentially buying government bonds. So we now have a $4.5 trillion debt to overseas lenders. So when does that have to be repaid? Does it have to be repaid? And how is it repaid without inflation And what is the effect on the economy if it is repaid? 4 simple questions.
Well, it's a debt. And we can, I mean, it's no different than defaulting on a debt to any lender. We owe those countries are giving us every year. And one of the points we make in our book is that every 4.5 years, every American household gets a free Jeep Grand Cherokee. That's essentially what we're getting without producing it. In other words, the rest of the world every 4.5 years is giving us the equivalent of a Jeep Grand Cherokee or BMW or whatever that $45,000 car is worth. Now, they're not stupid. They're not like, oh, we think you Americans need free goods. They're expecting a return. They're expecting 2 returns. One, for the Chinese, is to drive many of our industries out of business so they can then dominate global markets, which is what they've done in solar, and they plan to do it in many, 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 many industries, aviation being another one. And so, yes, ultimately we do have to repay that. And the only way we can repay that is by consuming less than we produce and increasing our productivity and increasing our competitiveness so that we can export more than we're importing. And that's really what it is. It's at the end of the day, if we do this, I'm enjoying a 5% higher standard of living than I should be, which is about what the trade deficit is. My son will be going the other 5%, not ideally, he'll have to pay 5%, he'll consume 5% less than he produces. And that's the world we're leaving our children. I don't see any way out of that unless we really focus on raising productivity and competitiveness.
Well, let me sum up by saying that I was heartened by seeing that there was agreement on the need for reform, probably a difference of agreement on the pace at which that reform needs to take place. I was struck by something that Dan wrote about when he urged people to look at the FT. I think actually he also talked about small businesses need to think about exporting more, that we need to focus more on the world. I think Rob would take that the next step and say we better see what the competition is like, not just an opportunity there. If we're 17th, if our 15-year-olds are 17th in science and 25th in mathematics, that's something to be worried about. We ought to focus on it and figure out what to do about it. I was struck too by Dan's, I mean, sort of it fits my philosophy, always light a candle, don't curse the darkness. There's lots of darkness to curse, of course. But Ed focused on his conversations with Dean Kamen and Dean's determination through FIRST Robotics to really not only change the culture, but to really encourage young people to get excited about math and science and so forth. This is a sort of truth in lending here. I'm very involved in FIRST Robotics myself, and as you get outside Washington, you see lots of candles being lit, and they are very, very enthusiastic. There's an interest, they're volunteers. Some of the schools are now giving letters in FIRST Robotics and so forth. So there is, I think, that potential that really will benefit from the kind of national leadership that could come if, in fact, you're right, we can get over this political gridlock. Well, thank you all for coming. Please join me in a round of applause for a fabulous panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Felicitously moderated.
What's that?
You
No, my father did.
Get in touch with you.
What year was
I think I did.
55.
Yeah.
well before me.
He's in the